The desert is silent. Wind drags fine dust across an empty road that leads to a fortress unlike any other. A structure carved out of stone, shaped like a giant triangle, its walls towering 30 feet into the air. From above, it resembles a scar burned into the earth, isolated, cold, unyielding. This was no ordinary prison. It was a machine of fear. They called it the Prison of Shadows. At first, it was said to be just another detention facility, a place to hold criminals, rebels, or those who had crossed the ruling regime. But soon, whispers began to spread. Whispers of screams echoing through the walls. Whispers of people taken in the night, who never returned. The Prison of Shadows became a name forbidden to speak aloud. Mothers were warned not to mention it in front of their children. Fathers pretended it didn't exist. And yet, nearly every family in the country knew someone who had vanished inside its walls. The origins of the prison go back decades. Official records claimed it was built during a period of conflict to house war criminals and traitors. But its triangular design hinted at something more: efficiency in control, precision in surveillance, and above all, the ability to turn human beings into statistics. 3 wings extended from a central hub, allowing guards to oversee hundreds of cells at once. Each wing had 3 levels, stacked like shelves of human misery. Prisoners described it as a labyrinth of concrete, steel, and darkness. And the design served one ultimate purpose: to erase people. At first, the prison was hidden from the public. Families who searched for loved ones were told, "There is no record, no such name." But rumors soon began to surface from the few who managed to escape or bribe their way out. They spoke of endless corridors that reeked of blood and sweat, of guards trained not to see the prisoners as human beings, but as numbers. Inside, torture was not an accident. It was a system. The most infamous device was known among prisoners as the human press. It was simple, brutal. A wooden board, heavy and wide, laid across the chest of a man forced to the ground. Then, one by one, bricks and stones were placed on top. At first, the man could still breathe, fighting against the crushing weight. But as the minutes passed, the air was squeezed from his lungs. His bones cracked. His ribs collapsed. Some lasted an hour, some only a few minutes. All ended the same. One former prisoner described the silence before the screams. You would hear the dragging of feet, the sound of chains, and then nothing. A pause. Everyone would hold their breath. And then it began, the crying, the begging, and finally the silence again. That silence was worse than the screaming. Cells meant for 2 people were filled with 20. Prisoners slept standing, leaning against one another like corpses. Food was stale bread soaked in dirty water. Diseases spread quickly, and treatment was rare. And yet, despite the horror, prisoners clung to life. They scratched their names into walls with nails, stones, even teeth, desperate proof that they had once existed. For every man inside, there was a family outside left in darkness. Mothers who knocked on government offices begging for information. Wives who waited at bus stops for men who would never return. Children who grew up hearing their father's name whispered only at night. One woman recalled waiting every Friday outside the prison gates, holding a small bag of food and clothes. The guards never accepted them. She left them at the door, praying they would reach her son. Years later, when the gates were finally breached, she found the same bag still inside, untouched, rotting, a symbol of forgotten hope. Why build such a place? Why invest in cruelty? The answer was control. The Prison of Shadows was not just about punishing individuals. It was about sending a message to the entire nation. We own your fear. We own your silence. Every scream was a warning. Every disappearance was a weapon, and it worked. For decades, the fortress operated without challenge. Foreign governments turned a blind eye. International organizations were denied access. Those who asked too many questions disappeared themselves. Still, stories leaked out. One guard smuggled letters to families. Another prisoner, released after 10 years, described mass hangings where men were lined up under a single beam, their bodies dropping into a pit below. Others spoke of chemical rooms experiments to test how long a man could survive under different gases. But the most terrifying whispers were about the basement. Prisoners called it the underworld. No one returned from it. Chains lined the walls, iron hooks dangled from ceilings, and in the farthest chamber, a pit was said to hold the remains of thousands. When asked how many had died there, one former guard replied, "Count the stars, then double them." By the late years, the prison was overflowing. Tens of thousands crammed into spaces built for only a few thousand. The regime used it not only for rebels, but for anyone who spoke too loudly, anyone suspected of dissent, anyone unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And yet still, the machine of horror expanded. One night, a man taken in for nothing more than a missing tax payment was thrown into the same cell as hardened criminals and suspected traitors. He lasted 2 weeks before he disappeared into the basement. For years, the world knew nothing. But technology changed everything. Smuggled phones brought out grainy images. Secret witnesses recorded testimonies. International human rights groups began piecing together a story of a fortress where an estimated 40,000 people were exterminated, where bodies were buried in mass graves under the desert sand, where even death certificates were forged to hide the truth. The prison of shadows was no longer a whisper. It was a scream the world could no longer ignore. But this was only half the story. Because deep within the fortress, hidden behind layers of steel doors and silence, another secret thrived. A secret not of torture, but of profit. A secret that turned human misery into billions of dollars. It was here, in the darkest corners of the prison, that the regime built something even more sinister than death. A narco-state fueled by addiction, corruption, and blood. At first glance, the prison was only a place of punishment, a fortress of fear, built to silence voices and erase lives. But behind those walls, another empire was quietly thriving. An empire not of justice, but of drugs. Because the prison of shadows was more than a detention center. It was a factory of addiction, a narco-state disguised as a prison. For years, guards were paid almost nothing. Their loyalty was secured not through wages, but through opportunities. Opportunities to smuggle, to trade, to profit. Inside the prison, drugs became the lifeblood of survival. A small bag of powder could buy protection, food, even freedom from torture. Guards supplied it, prisoners distributed it, and the warden took his cut of every single transaction. But this was no small-time operation. Soon the system expanded beyond the walls. Prisoners with connections to the outside world became brokers. Orders were passed in coded letters, in whispered phone calls smuggled through hidden SIM cards. The prison of shadows was not only consuming drugs, it was exporting them. Opium, hashish, and later synthetic chemicals. Some were produced in secret workshops beneath the prison. Others were trafficked through military convoys disguised as government shipments. The regime realized something powerful. The very prison built to destroy its enemies could also finance its survival. At the center of it all was the warden, a man known only as the Minister of Silence. Cold, calculating, untouchable. He rarely appeared in public, yet his reach extended across the nation. Under his rule, the prison became a hub for laundering money, negotiating with gangs, and controlling the flow of narcotics into cities. Every gram that left the prison carried his mark. Every life destroyed by addiction outside its walls was another coin in his treasury. And the profits were staggering. On the streets, heroin from the prison fetched fortunes. Synthetic pills were spread in schools, nightclubs, even military barracks. One former soldier confessed that he was given prison-made stimulants before combat missions, designed to keep him awake for days without sleep. "I wasn't fighting for my country," he said. "I was fighting for their drugs." The prison had transformed into something unthinkable. A place where death inside fueled addiction, outside. The scale of the operation drew attention abroad. Smugglers linked the prison to routes across the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. Ships carrying containers of legal goods often hid bricks of narcotics deep inside. Whistleblowers claimed that officials at the highest levels were involved. Planes carrying humanitarian aid were rumored to also transport drugs. Even foreign banks unknowingly laundered millions of dollars in blood money from the prison's empire. One investigator described it as, not a prison, not a cartel, but something in between a shadow state. But for every dollar earned, there was a body buried. Addiction tore through communities. Families that once lost sons to prison cells were now losing them to needles. Doctors in small towns reported waves of overdoses, entire generations wiped out. And still, the government denied everything. Official reports called it enemy propaganda. Journalists who dug too deep disappeared. The prison kept working, day and night. Yet even inside, cracks began to form. Prisoners who once cooperated with the drug trade grew tired of the endless cycle. Some began secretly recording evidence. Others passed information to families outside. One smuggled USB drive carried videos of workshops inside the basement, men stirring chemicals, guards counting stacks of cash. The footage was grainy, but undeniable. And slowly, the world began to wake up. By the late 2010s, international agencies launched investigations. Sanctions were placed on senior officials. Hidden bank accounts were frozen. But the fortress itself stood untouchable. Its walls still towered, its secrets still buried. Until the uprising. One night, in the heart of the prison, chaos erupted. A shipment of drugs went missing. Guards accused prisoners. Prisoners accused guards. A fight broke out, spreading from cell to cell. Within hours, thousands of men were rioting. Fires lit the sky. Chains were broken. The prison shook with the sound of rage, decades of silence exploding into violence. Outside, the regime panicked. For the first time in history, the prison of shadows was out of control. When soldiers finally stormed the facility, what they found shocked even them. Burned workshops, smashed laboratories, tunnels leading to secret vaults of cash and chemicals. But worst of all, the basement. There, mass graves were uncovered. Piles of bones, clothing, and chains told the story no government could ever again deny. The truth of the prison of shadows was finally revealed. Today, the fortress stands abandoned, its walls cracked, its corridors silent. But the legacy of its crimes lives on in the families who still search for answers, in the addicts whose lives were stolen by its drugs, and in the governments that once looked away. Some say the ghosts of the prisoners still walk the halls, whispering their names to anyone who dares enter. Others believe the fortress is cursed, that anyone who tries to rebuild it will vanish as those inside once did. The prison of shadows was not just a place, it was a mirror reflecting the darkest side of power, how fear can be weaponized, how silence can be bought, and how human life can be reduced to profit. And though its gates are closed, its story is far from over. Because somewhere, in another corner of the world, another fortress is being built. Another machine of silence. Another prison of shadows.